Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 37, and it seems the news is coming thick and fast from Ukraine and from Russia. We can barely keep up with the torrent of events. But in this segment, we'll try to give you a bit of an overview, a bit of a flavor of what's going on, and we'll try to introduce themes that will then follow up in more depth in the detailed interviews that we do with our incredible speakers. Let's start with the Kyiv Independent. Ukrainian Air Force downs 10 out of 10 Russian drones launched overnight. This is a story released earlier today. Ukrainian air defense units shot down 10 out of the 10 Shahid drones launched by Russian forces overnight, the Air Force reported on the morning of February the 28th. The Russian military launched 10 drones from the coastal city of Primorsko-Ahtarsk in Russia. The Air Force also reported that Russian troops fired S-300 anti-aircraft missiles from occupied Donetsk Oblast. Now, it seems no one was killed or injured, but earlier in the night, the Southern Defense Forces reported that debris from an intercepted drone caused a fire at an infrastructure facility in Odessa. This might not seem remarkable because this happens day in, day out. But having a hit rate of 10 out of 10 is extraordinary in this stage of the war. And whereas a lot of the focus of discussion is on supplying Ukraine with 155mm shells and other armament, Taurus, and so on, it's also critical to remember that it also needs a constant flow of anti-aircraft missiles and munitions to help it fight off Russia's vicious attacks on its civilian population and upon its cities. Now, not all cities are defended as well as Kyiv, so you'll see in Kharkiv and Kherson a far higher mortality rate, a far higher impact on the local populations, as well as a more destructive impact on the infrastructure of those cities, on civilian dwellings, apartment blocks, houses, businesses, and so on. And if it's not obvious to everyone, we need to call out that all of this is illegal. Intentionally targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is against the established rules of war. Russia is acting as a terrorist state and a war criminal. Ukraine's actions in downing the drones follows hard on the heels of another extraordinary run of success, one which again gets limited coverage in the mainstream media. And that is that the Ukrainian Air Force shot down not just one, but two Su-34 aeroplanes in a single day. This was reported yesterday, which was Tuesday the 27th, but that comes after the previous 9 days saw a further 9 Russian aeroplanes shot down. What an extraordinary run of success by the Ukrainian forces. Those same forces shot down a second Russian Su-34 attack plane in a single day on February the 27th. Air Force Commander Mikhailo Aleshchuk initially reported one Su-34 shot down in the eastern sector, but then followed that news up again in the afternoon that a second one had been downed. The destruction of the jet is the latest in a recent uptick of downed Russian planes, including two A-50 early warning and control aircraft in the past 2 months. Now, these cost a staggering amount of money. It's estimated around $330 million. Now, whereas these are sunk costs, Russia has had these planes for a considerable amount of time, it does not have new ones. It only has a finite number of these assets, and it does not have the capability or potentially the finances to manufacture more of them. So this is incredibly significant on the Ukrainian side. It also limits Russia's potential to not only target the occupied territories or to target Ukrainian lines, it also blunts Russia's ability to tackle the F-16s when they eventually make it into the theatre of combat. Russia has lost around 340 planes since the beginning of the full-scale invasion on February the 24th, 2022, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces reported. Ukraine in recent days has also reportedly downed Su-34 planes, Su-35S plane, another Su-34 on February the 18th, and so on. It's an extraordinary total of success, and As the title of the video asks, does it mean that Ukraine is gaining mastery not just of the Black Sea and winning the maritime war? It looks like Ukraine may also be edging ahead and starting to win the air war as well. And how is Ukraine achieving this? Well, it's a very difficult balance. Air defense is provided to protect civilians, but it looks like air defense systems are being used incredibly effectively to shoot down Russian fighter and command aircraft. And it's a difficult balance because by shooting these down, Ukraine may actually be blunting Russia's ability to strike Ukrainian cities. So it's a hard choice to make. The Kyiv Post quotes an article from Forbes that asks, is Ukraine depleting its best air defense missiles by downing Russian fighter and command aircraft? Forbes suggests that Ukraine's success in downing jets stems from their use of American-made Patriot and NASAMS missile systems. They say the risk lies in the lack of US ammunition supply to replenish those missiles that are being launched. The success is extraordinary. As we've said, 11 Russian warplanes have been shot down in just 10 days. According to Forbes, this represents a significant blow to Russian forces as they will struggle to keep up production of new jets due to foreign sanctions. And when it comes to the really specialist aircraft, it may be impossible for them to replenish those. Russia manages to produce only a couple of dozen new warplanes a year, and they are losing jets at a rate 20 times faster than they can replace them. And while we're seeing success at sea and success in the air, it is not quite the same picture on the ground. Ukraine is moving to a defensive position, as the US has for quite a number of months been advocating, and it seems that this is central to General Syrski's strategy, at least for the short to medium term. Ukraine has withdrawn from two more villages near Avdiivka called Stepovye and Severny. Ukraine also reports heavy battles in the Bakhmut direction as Russia is pulling in huge amounts of reserves in that area. The two villages that Ukraine has withdrawn from are located north of Lastachkinia, which was occupied by Russian troops on February the 26th. Before the start of the full-scale invasion, around 100 people lived in those two villages combined. According to Dmitry Likhovy, a spokesman for Ukraine's Tavaria group, said on national television that Russia had increased the number of assault units in the area. Some of them can reach the number of a company, which is up to 250 soldiers. Ukraine withdrew from the small industrial city of Avdiivka in the Donetsk Oblast on February the 17th. And as you'll know, this was amidst ammunition shortages after many, many months of repelling Russia's renewed offensive. After the capture of Avdiivka, Russia intensified its offensive efforts along various parts of Ukraine's front line, likely in order to stretch Ukrainian forces, as was reported by the UK Defence Ministry. But it seems their tactics have not changed. They still use the same tactic of laying down artillery barrages, followed by columns of armor, much of which is taken out. When those tanks are all gone, they try the same tactic again and again and again to try and wear the Ukrainians down. Eventually, this does seem to have some effect, as we've seen in Avdiivka, but it comes at an extraordinary cost. Russia is burning through people and burning through its equipment at a far faster rate than it can replenish it, and a far faster rate than Ukraine. Now, the last story we'll cover in today's Bites, we'll look at that in a little more detail. Now we'll look at the extraordinary pronouncement of Emmanuel Macron that he doesn't rule out the possibility of sending Western troops to Ukraine. This has caused something of a furore. Countries, including Germany, perhaps not a surprise, but other NATO members, as well as the UK, have very quickly reacted to say that they are not contemplating sending troops, putting boots on the ground into Ukraine at this time. French President Emmanuel Macron said on February the 26th that the possibility of sending Western troops on the ground in Ukraine is not ruled out in the future. This follows discussions amongst European leaders as Russia's full-scale invasion enters its third year. We will do everything needed so Russia cannot win the war. Now, this is a hardening of statements, which is to be welcome. We're moving from as long as it takes to Russia must not win. It will take just a short step to get to the phrase which must be in the mouth of every single Western political leader, and that is, we will do everything it takes for Russia to lose. We are getting closer and closer to that statement of strategy. Macron made this declaration during a gathering of 20 European heads of state and other officials in Paris. The meeting included German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, as well as leaders from the Baltic states. There is no consensus today to send in an official, endorsed manner of troops on the ground, but in terms of dynamics, nothing can be ruled out, said Macron. And this is far more hardline than anything he has yet said. He also chided Germany about making promises to deliver certain things, such as tanks, and then not delivering on time or in the quantities promised. So there's a little bit of detectable friction here between France and Germany, and potentially between Germany and other allies in Europe. And this is something that will be interesting to watch, because anyone watching this channel will know that whereas Germany has been supplying an awful lot, there are critical weapon systems that are in the purview of the Chancellor to provide, but he has not yet done this. In fact, he's shown himself implacably opposed to providing Taurus. Now, despite what the Vatniks may say, and people like Carlson, McGregor, and others who are parroting Russian lines, the supply of Taurus at scale and in good quantities would make a significant strategic impact on the war in Ukraine's favor. And another piece of positive news, this again is a follow-up to the story we covered in the last bite, and that is that France and the Netherlands back the Czech plan to buy ammunition for Ukraine outside of the EU. France and the Netherlands back Czechia's plan to procure hundreds of thousands of ammunition rounds for Ukraine from outside the EU. French President Emmanuel Macron and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte told journalists on February the 26th. It's also significant that Mark Rutte is also being considered as a potential head of NATO to replace Jens Stoltenberg, who is slated to retire. Kyiv is facing critical ammunition shortages as the $61 billion in funding from the US remains stuck in Congress. We say stuck in Congress. It's blocked by just a handful of people, including the so-called Moscow Mike, Speaker of the House. This is causing defense aid deliveries for Ukraine to run dry. Reports suggest that Ukraine could face a catastrophic shortage of supplies like shells and air defenses within weeks. And in fact, you will know from the Silicon Bites and from the interviews we've been doing that many parts of the front are already experiencing this shell shortage, this shell famine. And it was one of the critical reasons why Ukraine had to withdraw from Avdiivka. Earlier in February, Czechia began to push a plan to jointly finance the purchase of 450,000 artillery shells outside the EU. Czech President Petr Pavel said on February 17th that Prague has identified around 800,000 artillery shells abroad that could be sent to Ukraine within weeks if provided funding from the partners. And it now looks like European countries are joining this coalition of the willing, coalition of the action-oriented countries to actually put the financing behind the plan. This is a positive step, and we will certainly report on further developments as they unfold. And in more positive news, the Netherlands has ordered 9 howitzers for Ukraine from Czechia. Dutch Defense Ministry ordered 9 Dieter howitzers from Czech manufacturers for Ukraine, its press service reported on February 27th. The Netherlands is investing in the production capacity of the European defense industry, the Dutch Defense Ministry said in an online statement. If we do not do this, it will be at the expense of our own safety, the statement read. The howitzers are part of a large order, quotes, from the Netherlands and will be delivered to Ukraine, the ministry said, without specifying when they would arrive. The Netherlands earlier in the year requested Czechia to produce 100 MP2 anti-aircraft guns for drone disposal and, together with the US, 100 upgraded T-72 tanks, which are well known to Ukrainian soldiers and do not require additional training. In February, the Netherlands, a major provider of military support to Ukraine, pledged to provide Kyiv with 100 million euros in aid to help buy ammunition and joined the Latvia-led coalition to strengthen Kyiv's drone arsenal. The country also took the lead, along with Denmark, in establishing a coalition to provide F-16 fighter jets for Ukraine. As of February 2024, the Netherlands has pledged to send 24 F-16s to Ukraine. And when they finally arrive, when these munitions arrive, it will make a substantial difference on Ukraine's ability to hold back the aggressive Russian assaults. So on the one hand, Ukraine is achieving great success in countering Russian drone warfare, especially against its civilian objectives. On the other hand, Ukraine is pinning its hopes on achieving further victories in the war on homemade drones to counter Russia, the Kyiv Independent reports. President Volodymyr Zelensky announced on February the 7th that the Ukrainian military would create a separate branch of the armed forces dedicated to drones. Throughout the full-scale invasion, Ukraine has been a drones tactics pioneer, from applying purpose-built military UAVs to weaponizing civilian models of drones. Last year, the first-person view, the FPV kamikaze drones, gained notoriety for their simple construction, low cost, but high damage. Unlike drones that are meant to survive, like battlefield scouts or grenade droppers, FPV drones are meant to fly into their target and explode. To be cost effective, they should be as cheap and bare bones as possible. These qualities open up the possibility of non-engineers making drones at home, and the Ukrainian government began to promote initiatives like People's FPV, Narodny FPV, that thousands have already joined. And this is an extraordinary echo of how the war started. You'll remember the images of Ukrainians making Molotov cocktails in their homes, and then some people actually throwing them at the Russians from their personal cars. You'll also remember the images of more recent times of Ukrainians making camo netting, care packages for soldiers, and all sorts of other things. Ukrainian workshops, garages, and so on that were converted into the production of so-called hedgehogs. That is the sort of steel barriers, the tank traps that are put in place around cities to slow down the advance of Russian armor. And this is an extraordinary continuation of what is essentially Ukraine's advantage, and that is the horizontal against the vertical. That's the ability of Ukrainians to weigh in its massive civil and volunteer society to actually produce stuff that is useful to enhance Ukraine's resilience and its ability to fight Russian aggression. So this is an incredible initiative. As the months go on, it will be important for Ukrainians to work collaboratively with its partners. It will be important for Ukraine to work collaboratively with its partners to understand where these components come from, where they can be easiest to manufacture, where the materials exist to produce them, and perhaps not try to do the end-to-end process in Ukraine, but reach out to partners to see where we can help weigh in with those crucial materials and components and skill sets that are required to create a vast drone army. And we will stay with news about Ukraine because this is a really interesting story from the Kyiv Independent. It asks, who is Viktor Pavlychuk, newly elected head of the Ukrainian anti-corruption agency? And I think this is an interesting story because despite all the stories about the war, the front lines, and so on, we have Navalny and what's going on in Russia. Quietly behind the scenes, there are many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of people in Ukraine working to still, even in wartime, improve the quality of governance, transparency in governments, transparency behind contracts for the military and civilian spheres, and there are people who are working hard to root out corruption. Viktor Pavlyushuk was chosen on February the 25th as the head of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention, one of Ukraine's main corruption-fighting bodies. The Cabinet of Ministers is yet to appoint him to that position, but this is quite an important appointment nonetheless. He's been praised by anti-corruption activists and his former colleagues as someone who is expert in this field and can be trusted. The main tasks of this body in Ukraine's system is to look at the asset declarations for state officials. Now, this is a key anti-corruption tool, not just to root out corruption that exists, but also to prevent it happening. It's a great deterrence for potential corruption to know that there are people who are potentially unbribable, who are on the lookout for graft, and to ensure that sectional interests do not damage the governance of the country. This is especially important in wartime. Anti-corruption activists criticized the selection board for a lack of transparency, but praised the eventual result, the person they'd chosen to lead this body. Now, there's lots of information in this article about who the other candidates were, various potential rumors and issues associated with them, but it does seem that the best person for the job has been chosen at precisely the best time. We'll put a link to that article in the description of the video. And we go from fighting corruption in Ukraine to embedded corruption and nepotism in its aggressive neighbor, Russia. This article from the Kyiv Independent reports that a leak of secret Kremlin files reveal how Putin has pre-rigged his election. Now, this won't come as any surprise. The investigation is based on leaks obtained by Delphi Estonia and is compiled for a joint investigation between V-Square and frontstory.pl, Expressen, Medusa, and iStories. Paper Trail Media, Der Spiegel, ZDF, Der Standard, and Tamedia Productions, and it's been republished in the Kyiv Independent with their permission. I think this is, despite being fairly predictable, it is a very interesting story nonetheless. And we can see that Putin's re-election process is not simply confined to mainland Russia. In fact, the newly annexed territories that are in fact part of Ukraine, form an integral role in Putin's re-election process. Colonel Artyom Zhoga, commander of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic Sparta Battalion, delivered a spirited speech in which he asked Putin to run again in the upcoming presidential elections. "We are your team. We need you. Russia needs you," he pleaded with Putin. Naturally, Putin agreed. And naturally, it was all a charade. No one doubted that Putin would run in the elections. No one would doubt that he will win them overwhelmingly. The Kremlin least of all, because they've done everything in their power to ensure that the March 17 elections are guaranteed to end with Putin's triumph. In the leaked documents, these activities, the various layers of activities that are conducted to rig the election, are literally and unashamedly called an information war, even though that war is being waged against their own society. And this is a point we've made on the channel. We really do focus on Russia's aggression against its neighbors, against the West as well. But Russia is also fighting a genocidal war against its own population, decimating the population that would be classed as ethnic minorities outside of Moscow, those who are poor, those who do not have any wealth or agency or influence within society. Putin is also waging this war of repression, this informational war against his own people. The total planned budget for the three main categories, the presidential election, the information war, and the occupied areas in Ukraine, reach 1.1 billion euros. The largest share of it, up to 631 million euros, was allocated for the information war, according to the leaked documents. And the Kremlin is paying special attention to what it calls the new territories, the occupied areas in Ukraine, where it has sunk billions of rubles to ensure the local population's loyalty. And if they don't show that loyalty, they are tortured or sent to the front. Now, the investigators have consulted several Russian analysts to verify the authenticity of the leaked documents. In addition, they compared the content with publicly available Russian state budget data and found several projects that overlap. Unlike the leaked files, the public budget does not disclose the purpose of the sums. They also looked for references to the implementation of the project that received funding from public sources, and in many cases found the details. So this is quite an important piece of analysis, and it seems that the documents are important for two reasons. First, they confirm exactly how the Kremlin is trying to reshape the entire ideology of the Russian state. Secondly, they show how it is carried out on a micro level. This is a quote from Mark Galeotti, who has reviewed the leaked documents and seems relatively confident of their veracity. Galeotti also states, underneath all its pomp, Putin's regime is one that believes it's in terrible trouble. And another leaked document is covered by the Kyiv Independent in this story, and that is about leaked files revealing Russia's military criteria for nuclear strikes. Leaked military documents outline Russia's doctrine for tactical nuclear weapons use, including the minimum criteria for tactical nuclear weapons. This was reported by the Financial Times on February the 28th. And of course, the frightening thing here is that the minimum criteria for using tactical battlefield nuclear weapons are far lower than many people expected. Russia's tactical nuclear weapons are designed for use on the battlefields of Europe and Asia and have a more limited range compared to strategic nuclear weapons. Those, of course, can reach the US. 29 Russian military files, which date between 2008 and 2014, indicate a threshold lower than Russia has ever publicly admitted, according to experts who have reviewed the documents. The criteria range from an enemy incursion on Russian territory to more specific triggers, such as the destruction of 20% of Russia's strategic ballistic missile submarines, the destruction of 3 or more large surface warships, 3 airfields, 30% of its nuclear-powered attack submarines, or a simultaneous hit on main and reserved coastal command centers are also listed as potential conditions for a nuclear strike. And this is actually interesting because, of course, the US has been at pains throughout the war to ensure that Ukraine does not invade Russian territory, does not use Western weapons to make incursions, major incursions onto Russian territory. And it may be insights into Russia's tactical nuclear response that actually underpin some of these fears and constraints. Some of these criteria also may have been met, including the recent destruction of an extraordinary number of Russian planes, the attacks on numerous Russian airfields, logistic bases, and oil production and storage facilities. So whether this doctrine is about a simultaneous strike or destruction of the lists that we've gone through, or whether it actually foresees a kind of boiling the frog type strategy, which is what Ukraine is now doing by destroying significant numbers of Russian military and logistical assets, it's not clear how this might relate to its responses in the context of the Ukraine war. What's also interesting in here is an indication that Moscow may also fear that Beijing could take advantage of its military forces towards the West and launch an attack across the border to gain, or to use the anti-colonial narrative, to regain territory in Russia's Far East. The Financial Times highlighted that Russia continues to conduct military exercises near China, holding exercises in June and November 2023 in regions bordering China using nuclear-capable missiles. There's a bit more information in this report. It's absolutely fascinating, and I advise you, if you do have access to the Financial Times, do read the full piece on their website. It is quite an extraordinary piece of reporting. Well, let's turn to the internal situation in Russia now. This is a story from the Moscow Times, and it is about the veteran human rights activist Oleg Orlov, who has just been sentenced to 2.5 years sentence in Russia for opposing the Ukraine war. He's quoted as saying, "I believe in a better future." A Moscow court sentenced the veteran human rights campaigner Oleg Orlov to 2.5 years in prison on Tuesday for speaking out against the war in Ukraine and apparently discrediting the Russian military. Orlov is the co-chair of the Nobel Prize-winning Memorial Human Rights Group and is one of the few prominent anti-war figures who stayed in Russia since the invasion. Ahead of his sentencing on Tuesday, Orlov told the Moscow Times he viewed the prosecutor's request to jail him as a demand from the top, but said he still has hopes for change in Russia, that he believes in a better future. The charges that were made under Russia's wartime censorship laws carry a punishment of up to 5 years in prison. At the time, the prosecutor issued the fine due to mitigating circumstances, including Orlov's age and testimonies by his supporters. Russian authorities accuse Orlov of discrediting the armed forces based on an article primarily that he wrote in November 2022 titled, "They Wanted Fascism, They Got It." In this article, Orlov stated that the war against Ukraine is a severe blow to Russia's future and that the Kremlin seeks to use the invasion as a tool to achieve its political goals. And by implication, he is saying that those goals are akin to fascistic ones. And to continue the repression that is ramping up in Russia, here is a story about Alexei Navalny, and the public funeral for Navalny is set to take place on March the 1st, according to allies of his. A public funeral for the late opposition leader will be held Friday afternoon at a church in southeastern Moscow, his spokeswoman, Kira Yarmoush, announced on social media on Wednesday. The funeral service will take place at a Russian Orthodox church in Moscow's Marino district, where Navalny had lived with his wife and 2 children before being poisoned in 2020 and then arrested following his return to Russia the following year. "Come early," they said. "The burial will be held at the Borisov Cemetery," Yarmoush wrote on X, formerly Twitter, referring to a cemetery in the same district. Now, there have been many stories over the last week about the Kremlin trying to suppress first the handover of Navalny's body and then trying to suppress the idea of any kind of public funeral taking place. The authorities really did not want a public funeral, as it could turn into a show of support for Navalny's movement and, of course, opposition to President Vladimir Putin. Navalny's top aide, Ivan Zhdanov, said the team initially planned to hold the ceremony on Thursday, but claimed that every funeral home in Moscow had refused to take the body because of Putin's scheduled address to the Russian parliament that day. Also accused the authorities of intervening to keep Navalny's family from booking a larger venue for a public memorial service. There have also been suggestions that this funeral will become an excuse or an event where the regime can seek to round up opponents. Anyone showing public support for Navalny may be at risk of arrest on the day or subsequent arrest once they are tracked using face recognition and then targeted at their places of work or their homes. In conjunction with this story is another one in the Moscow Times, and it's about Yulia Navalnaya, who is urging EU politicians to target Western assets of Putin's inner circle. She has stepped into the shoes that Navalny is no longer able to fulfill, and she has become a strong voice for Navalny's organization and colleagues. Navalny's late widow, appeared in the European Parliament and urged European politicians to investigate the Western assets of President Putin and his inner circle. On Wednesday, you cannot hurt Putin with another resolution or another set of sanctions, Navalny told the European Parliament in Strasbourg. The most important thing is people who are close to Putin, his friends, associates, and keepers of mafia money. You and all of us must fight against this criminal gang, she said. Navalny added that the West should aim for investigations into the financial mechanism, not statements of concern, but a search for mafia assets in your countries. Everything has already been used. Weapons, money, sanctions, nothing is working. And the worst has happened. Everyone is getting used to this war, she said. Putin is the leader of an organized criminal gang. The public murder of her husband, she said, showed everyone that Putin is capable of anything and that you cannot negotiate with him. He is not a good faith actor. Navalny said she feared disruption and arrests at her husband's public funeral, which is set to take place. I'm not sure yet whether it will be peaceful or whether the police will arrest those who've come to say goodbye to my husband, she said. Now, this is a hardening of language by Russia's really only visible opposition, but it seems that it is still following the broad tactic adopted by Alexei Navalny of pursuing peaceful protest. No word of any move to a more vigorous, let's say, approach to oppose Putin's regime. And that is the subject of another article in the Moscow Times, which asks, after Navalny, what next for Russia's opposition? This is written by Boris Bondarev, who is the only high-ranking diplomat to have actually broken with Putin's regime and defected. He writes that Alexei Navalny was undoubtedly the brightest star in the Russian opposition. However, for all his charisma and energy, he failed to unite the entire opposition, or at least a majority of it, under his banner. He did not, nor did he strive to do this, writes Boris, often taking an extremely tough and uncompromising stance. His associates in the Anti-Corruption Foundation, who position themselves as the main opposition force, take the same approach that they have inherited from Navalny. They've repeatedly shown their unwillingness to work with or even appear alongside other opposition movements, such as the supporters of Maxim Katz, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and other leading figures and movements. Now, despite what Boris says here, there are communications, extensive communications, I believe, that happen behind the scenes between these individuals. They do meet, they do talk, they do discuss policies, tactics, etc. So it's not that they are in complete isolation. However, it is an issue that Russia's opposition cannot unite around a strategy or an approach, because that does ultimately result in less action on the ground in opposing Putin's regime. Now, this is a fascinating article. It discusses the dire need in Russia for responsible politicians who can grasp the demand for fresh solutions, as Boris says here, including a way to represent Russians abroad. There is not the equivalent government in exile that you have for the Belarusian opposition, who seem to have a far more coordinated approach to trying to unseat Lukashenko, their fascistic dictator. Boris also writes, the opposition in Russia is largely made up of relatively young people with naive views and little experience. He claims they're driven by emotion rather than reason. But I think the big challenge is going to be for the opposition in the coming months, with some who will be losing faith in the ability of peaceful protest to achieve anything. We may well see some turning to violent opposition, in their view, as the only way to fight a regime which behaves like a mafia and which destroys its opponents with absolute impunity. We will follow this story closely. Now we're getting close to the end. Here's an interesting one. Again, Moscow Times, and this is just breaking in the last couple of days, and it is about pro-Russian separatists in the breakaway region of Moldova, of Transnistria, who are asking Moscow for protection, inverted commas. Now, we know what Russian protection means. Typically, it brings death, destruction, torture, and lawlessness. But pro-Russian rebels in Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria have appealed to Russia for protection on Wednesday amid fears the territory could open up to be a new flashpoint in Moscow's war with neighboring Ukraine. And this has been a fear throughout the last 2 years. It's highly likely that this would have happened sooner if Russian forces could have broken through southern Ukraine and reached Moldova. The thin strip of land has been de facto controlled by pro-Russian forces since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it is still an internationally recognized part of Moldova. Now, I think we need to be mindful here that if Putin can cause chaos, destruction, distractions from the war in Ukraine, he will absolutely do it. So this could be another flashpoint to watch out for in Putin's ongoing war against the democratic, civilized order. And I'm not going to dwell long on Clown World, but here are some of the more extraordinary headlines as reported by the amazing Julia Davis and Russian Media Monitor. Margarita Simonyan wants Westerners to move to Russia. Why not? If they watch Tucker Carlson's interview and they like shopping trolleys that have little money slots in them, then of course you'll be on the next plane out there. If, however, you're looking at alternative version of reality, the version of reality that we discuss on this channel, you will see Russia arresting anyone that shows any resistance, anyone with half a brain, or who goes on any kind of protest whatsoever or tries to organize politically. So if you value your democratic rights, your rights of expression, your rights of agency as a Westerner, why on earth would you move to Russia? It's absolutely delusional. Another extraordinary propagandist piece is Margarita Simonyan and Vladimir Solovyov blaming the West for Navalny's death. Some of you may have seen numerous conspiracy theories popping up on Russian propagandistic channels in the wake of the death of Navalny, basically accusing everybody of his murder except those who are no doubt culpable for it. And lastly, Vladimir Solovyov is getting his teeth into Yulia Navalny and already threatening her in fairly gross, violent, and ridiculous terms. That didn't take long. The funeral of Alexei has not yet taken place, but the focus of the propagandist is already squarely on his widow. And lastly, a couple of stories we're going to pop links into in the description of the video. And this really is something we have to remember, despite all the discussions around Russian opposition, etc., we have to focus on the fact that it is Ukraine that was attacked. Ukraine, as a peaceful democracy, did not seek this war and has lost an extraordinary number of people. Whether it was intentional or not, Zelensky seems to have hinted at a number, which is the first time he's done that since the start of the full-scale conflict. He has suggested that Ukraine has lost around 31,000 troops in the past 2 years. The estimate of Russian losses is 415,000 as it stands on this day, 28th of February. So that is an extraordinary difference, an extraordinary ratio between the losses of the two forces. But we must remember Russia does have a larger population and has far fewer concerns about who it sends to die in the fields and cities of Ukraine. And the last story here, which I think is interesting, this is someone who I would definitely like to interview on the channel. It's someone who has very, very close connections with the Ukrainian military, as well as the US and British, and that is Admiral Satoni Radakin. He has said that Ukraine will be on the back foot in this war for many months to come, largely because of the ammunition shortage that it's experiencing, but also potentially because of the slowness in launching a mobilization of the Ukrainian population to gear up for the next stage of the war. Admiral Suetonian Radakin, speaking at a conference in London, did not directly comment on a French suggestion of deploying Western ground troops in Ukraine, but instead emphasized the urgent need to increase industrial capacity so that we can supply Ukraine with the armaments that it needs. The military chief said Ukraine faced a difficult situation on land where its army was struggling in terms of ammunition and stockpiles. With the US aid halted in Congress and Europe not yet in a position to plug that gap. Radakin said that conversations were going on amongst NATO allies about how we can strengthen support for Ukraine, how we can strengthen supply to Ukraine. Let's hope that those conversations accelerate, and let's hope they deliver results in the coming months.